Hello, church. Pastor Zach here from the back garden of my mother-in-law, Kathy's house. It's very warm and humid here in Alabama, but we're enjoying our time with family this week, and we will return to Birkenhead next week. Excited to be back with you all. This morning we continue the series in Summer on the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount, this big sermon exposition that Jesus, this big teaching moment that Jesus brought to his disciples and to the crowds that followed. We learn as we read this that the intent initially for Jesus is to really open up the true meaning of what we call the law and the prophets that we find in the Old Testament. Really open it up to his disciples so that they can understand better the true intention behind them, the true purpose behind them, and because they're going to be his advocates in the world, right? They're going to be sharing his message and taking it forward when he goes away. But we look to Jesus and his fulfillment of the law, which encompasses which is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Old Testament. What we should be focusing on is the life and character of Jesus when we read those books. How he lived, worked, interacted with people, how he sacrificed himself and gave himself up for us and rose again, defeating death and ultimately defeating sin. Now, death is the result of sin that was brought into the world from the beginning. There was a moment in time when people lived in harmony with God. We read that Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden that he created for them. God gave the earth to them, to name it, to care for it, to multiply in it. But something happened. Something happened as they were doing this. Shame, guilt, and fear entered the equation. When Adam and Eve ate from a tree, they were instructed not to. Right? There was a temptation. There was an introduction of doubt from the enemy, from Satan. And because of that, they had to be expelled from this perfect world. And because of it, death entered the picture. But although it entered the picture, because they could no longer live in the perfect world, God did something while they were still feeling shame, guilt, and fear. He clothed them. We read the story in Genesis where they felt naked, they felt embarrassed, they felt shame in their skin. And God, even when they disobeyed, clothed them so they would not be naked. And in this process began restoration through a promise of a Savior, Jesus. In our text today, Matthew 5, verses 17 to 20, Jesus declares his purpose for those listening: to make right what was made wrong, to show the people that the laws they had been living by were not the full picture. He came to show them that the laws they were living by were not just about appearances. They were about our inner selves being transformed to the image God had intended. And so the text this morning, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 20, titled Teaching About the Law. Jesus says, "Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So what we are focusing on is the fact that Jesus came to show us what the true meaning of the law is, to show us what God's true intention was and is, how we should live, how we should work, how we should interact with people, how we should put others before ourselves. Now, when we look at the Old Testament, every Old Testament text must be viewed in light of Jesus' person and ministry, and the changes introduced by the new covenant, by the new relationship, by the new connection between us and the Father. He initiated, he inaugurated, he began. Now, when we consider the law and of the prophets, you might never have heard that before. This might be the first time you've actually heard that. Now, we know easily, we can look at the Ten Commandments. Moses went up to Mount Sinai while the people below were worshiping something that wasn't their God, right? We can read in the text that they worshipped a golden calf, right? So while Moses was there convening with God and as God is instructing him to live by these standards and bring these to the people were rebelling against. In their waiting, they found something different. So when we look at this, when we look at the law and the prophet and the prophets, we look at the first 5 books of the Old Testament, like I shared, and they have a lot of information. I mean, a lot. They're dense, and if you haven't read them before, I encourage you to do so. But when you do, we all must always consider the life of Jesus as we read them. Because if we just open up the book and begin to read, some of it might not make sense. If we don't understand who Jesus is and how he lived and what his purpose here on earth was, it might be confusing. So without the context of Jesus' life and what his purpose is, it can be a very strange experience reading them. It's really a story of how people tried to live out what they believed God wanted, or without God. And just for a bit more understanding, a bit more context for us today, I'll give just a brief overview of each of these books. And those are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And when you look at this, these are all they're very much intertwined and kind of happening in the same time. Some give a bit more context and a bit more dense information about what was occurring in one before it. So they're all really wrapped together about the story of God's people and what had happened as they were expelled from this perfect world, this perfect garden, and how they began to live and how they began to put their trust in people and kings and all these different things, and how prophets began to expose them to the reality that God is moving and that God is pointing to restoration and pointing to a Messiah. And then all these other little details and laws and different things that were supposed to help govern them and kind of direct them to live out as God intended. But as we know, so oftentimes when best laid plans don't often work out. But Genesis, so quickly, the theme of Genesis is creation. It's sin and recreation. God made the world very good, but then we read that he cursed it and destroyed it in the flood because of people's disobedience. Now, the new world after the flood was also spoiled by sin, human sin. But we read in Genesis that God chose Abraham, a guy named Abraham, for a special purpose. And he promised Abraham that through his family, all nations would be blessed. So this is kind of like the introduction of God's chosen people. And so through this family, all nations would be blessed. And God's purpose will eventually be fulfilled through the descendants of Abraham. And really kind of the key thing in Genesis is the Lord commissions human beings to be his representatives on earth. They're to take care of the earth and govern the other creatures. We go into Exodus. And the overarching theme of Exodus is the fulfillment of God's promises. The success of the Exodus must be ultimately credited to the power and purpose of God, who remembers promises that he's made, who punishes sin and forgives those who repent, those who are seeking forgiveness. Now, the book highlights Moses' faithfulness and prayerfulness. The people of God were living in Egypt as servants, enslaved to the Pharaoh. Moses received a message from God through a burning bush and exclaimed to Moses that the ground that he was walking on was holy. And God promised, remember, that in Genesis, that Abraham's family would inherit the earth. In Exodus, through this man Moses, God is fulfilling the promise. Then we get into this very dense book of Leviticus. And the purpose of Leviticus is to ultimately instruct Israel concerning how to, what? To maintain holiness, to maintain a good life within community, so that the Lord would continue to dwell among them. So he kind of instructs them, if you continue to maintain this good living, this holiness, God will continue to dwell among you. Now the Lord desires to dwell among his people so that he might bless them with his presence. If the Lord is with his people, Israel can then fulfill its call to be kingdom of priests. Right, to mediate what Abraham, the blessings of Abraham's family to the ends of the earth. Right, so they're called to be a kingdom of priests. They're called to be his advocates on the world, to help fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the earth. And so Leviticus is kind of helping point the people to how to live and how to maintain that community with God. And then we have the book of Numbers, and it might be a little bit of a confusing title, Numbers. It's not just a list of this and that and to-dos and don't-dos, but really if you look at the Hebrew, when we look at this word Numbers, it actually means in the wilderness. So the original Hebrew title of the book is called In the Wilderness. And that better exclaims or better describes what the purpose and what Numbers was really about. It describes the essence of the book. Now, the original purpose of Numbers was to warn this second generation, right? So we're already into the second generation of God's chosen people, of the Israel, not to go back into rebellion and unbelief that their first generation parents did. You know, remember Moses on Mount Sinai receiving these commandments from God, while the people down below, down at the basin of the mountain are living in rebellion. They're worshiping idols. They're doing all these things that they're not supposed to be doing, right? They just left Egypt. They just moved out of enslavement, and now they're again being enslaved by their own desires and all these different things. And so Numbers is a warning to not go back to that, right? To stay here in community and right relationship with God. Yet its deeper purpose was to encourage them that the Lord was with them and that he intended to fulfill his promise to their father Abraham, to give his descendants the land and through them to bless the nations. So don't go back. Don't go backward. Go forward with God, right? Because the promise is that you will bless the nations. And then finally we have Deuteronomy. And this is the final address by Moses to this second generation of God's chosen people, the second generation of Israel. And its purpose is to challenge this generation to total devotion to the Lord within a renewed relationship with God. In this final address, there were promising of blessings for loyalty and and really there was a threat of curses if they rebelled against it. And so Moses begins to reflect on the nation's past mistakes, right? All the things that were intended to be good but were made wrong because of this and that. So all the past mistakes, he's warning them, let's not go back to that, guys. Let's not go back to that. Moses urges the people not to repeat the errors when they enter the land that they were promised, the promised land. So just briefly, that was kind of just brief snippets of what kind of encompassed, what kind of made up the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is what we would, what we call the law and the prophets. Just basically the story of sin entering the world, the impact that it has on individuals and communities and people, how God tried to show them a better way, how even when shown a better way, the people still rebelled against it and went against it, and then how in fact do we live this way and maintain right relationship, right community with others and with God. And so Jesus then begins to introduce this and declare his true purpose for the disciples then in his world and his present time then, and how really we can take those and how they really kind of dictate where we are today. But I've quoted this guy a few times. He's an English writer and theologian. His name is N.T. Wright, or Tom Wright, and he wrote a commentary on Matthew, and he says this about it. He says, Jesus wasn't intending to abandon the law and the prophets. Israel's whole story, commands, promises, and all was going to come true in him. But now that he was here, a way was opening up for Israel, and through that, all the world, to make God's covenant a reality in their own selves, changing behavior not just by teaching, but by a change of heart and mind itself. This was truly revolutionary, and at the same time deeply in tune with the ancient stories and promises of the Bible. And the remarkable thing is that Jesus brought it all into reality in his own person. He was the salt of the earth. He was the light of the world, set up on a hilltop, crucified for all the world to see, becoming a beacon of hope and new life for everybody, drawing people to worship his Father, embodying the way of self-giving love, which is the deepest fulfillment of the law and the prophets. That's why these sayings, originally applied to Israel, now apply to all those who follow Jesus and draw on his life as the source of their own. How does this challenge affect us today? Where does the world need salt and light right now? And how can we, through following Jesus, provide it? What a great challenge for us today and for tomorrow and the days and weeks and months and years to come. As people of God, how are we seeing where the salt and light can be brought? You know, last week we looked at how we are the salt and the light, right? That salt as a preservative, we're here to preserve what is good and holy in the world and to bring taste to what God has intended and to be a light, right? And not a light that gets covered and blocked out, but a light that shines into dark places, that shines into the world. And so how can we, through following Jesus, provide it in our world today? You see, Jesus fulfills the law and prophets in ways that people did not expect. We must learn to live like Jesus did, so we too can fulfill the law through our love for other people. Later on, Jesus is challenged about what the greatest commandment is. And do you remember what that is? We've been sharing about it for several weeks, several months. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with your whole being, with your mind, your spirit, your heart, and to love your neighbor as yourself. By doing so, you fulfill the law. For the law's intended purpose was to live in right community with God and to live in right community with others. And so how are we as people of God, children of God, adopted sons and daughters of God, doing that today? God bless you guys. Love you. A few questions to consider this morning or today. Whenever you might listen to this sermon, a couple questions for us to consider. In light of what we've been reading, what does the Old Testament law make you think about? How hard is it to fulfill the details of the law? And if you're unfamiliar with the details, just Google search, what are the commandments? What are the 10 commandments that Moses was given? What are some of the laws that we find in Leviticus? Another question is, how does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament? And how can we follow Jesus' example and fulfill the law? And remember, what is the law about? How do we live in right community with God? How do we live in right community with others?